Now I'm quite happy to introduce Herman van der Werfhorst as our first keynote speaker. Herman van der Werfhorst is, among many other things, professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam and co-director of the Amsterdam Center for Inequality Studies. His work focuses on the role of educational institutions in producing inequalities. He's frequently crossing disciplinary boundaries, and his publications appeared in many different journals in sociology, political science, education, and economics. And we are really pleased that he accepted our invitation, as his research, very much in the spirit of the workshop, is at home in both sociology of education and the economics of education. In his keynote, he will discuss the relationship between school tracking policies and the inequality of opportunity. Herman, we look really forward to your presentation, and the stage is yours now.
Thank you very much, Norbert, and thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me. I really like to be here, not the least because it's at the WZB, which I really believe is a very nice institution that fosters all kinds of interdisciplinary research. I've been here quite a few times already. I'm a fellow of one of the groups here, and of course lately I haven't been able to come here as much as I would have hoped. So in that sense, it's a great pleasure for me to be here back in the first travel that I have since 2 years, like for many of us, I guess. It's also nice for me that this is a very interdisciplinary group, as was already mentioned. I think I'm very keen to cross boundaries and at least understanding what other fields are doing, working with people in other disciplines. I've done quite a bit of that. So for me, it's a great pleasure to be here. So I'll be here both days, and I'm also happy to see all your work and see what I can learn from that, because I'm sure that there will be a lot to learn. So what I will talk to you about today is work that comes from 2 different papers that I've been working on. Let's see if it works time-wise. And both are concerned with the issue of tracking in educational systems, a topic of quite strong interest in the Dutch debates, but also in Germany, I know, but also in other countries that we might not think of immediately, like England, where the grammar school has been at some form of revival. So in that sense, I hope to speak to many of the different audiences than just the Dutch or the Germans, but it is interesting for the Netherlands and Germany in particular, I would say. When it comes to how educational systems affect outcomes of children, so whether rules that we have in a society impact how inequalities evolve over the life course, is a broader interest of sociology, because as sociologists we're very interested in institutions. Institutions as being defined by an economist, by the way, Sam Bowles, in this very nice definition, formal and informal rules and regulations that give a durable structure to social interactions among members of a population. It's a very interesting definition because it includes both interactions and durable forms of interactions, and it includes formal and informal institutions. So I will talk mostly about formal institutions today, in the sense of how regulations are made in a country to have a certain level of tracking in a society, or the age at which this happens, or these kinds of things. But also informal institutions are part of the story, in the sense of norms that might exist, especially by subgroup, in terms of what would be the kind of right education. And these cultural processes that define, let's say, preferences of families are important to incorporate in our thinking of how institutional systems affect outcomes. It's not just a system that people randomly go into, no, it's a system that creates also some sort of reality, and therefore might even perpetuate inequalities through these cultural processes. And I will talk about that today more. Again, I focus mostly on tracking today, and I look at one comparative study and one study on the Netherlands. So basically, if I look at the broader field, there are some developments, not so new anymore maybe, but rather new, that looks at, there are 2 types of developments, I think, in the field when it comes to the institutional effects on inequalities. One is to look at institutions in a more dynamic way. Dynamic in the form of looking at reforms, obviously, but one could also look at dynamic in the sense of trying to capture the life course in a comparative design. There are these quasi-panel studies where kids of different age groups are compared in different countries, and if then institutions matter only for one age group, you would then see it more differing across one country than in another country. These kinds of difference in difference designs are there. I will look at a reform design, where I look at the age of tracking as it has been reformed in quite a few European countries in the past decades, and that I will look at. A second development, which I think is quite relevant, we're not there yet to fully understand what we should do in that field, but that's my ambition, let's say, is to look more at theorizing at the level of mechanisms, at the level of families, at the level of teachers and students, or micro-level social interactions, how they are shaped by the institutional structure. So those mechanisms in context, kind of label that I'm using for that, is a development that we need to work more on as a field, and we see this happening here and there. Earlier I've worked in a labor market kind of study, and for the economists among you, typically economists and also sociologists might sometimes have some sort of a mechanism contest, which mechanism works best. Is it human capital or screening, or is it, these kinds of competitions of mechanisms. They're interesting, but we should advance the field by saying, okay, but the context determines whether one theory might work better than in another context. So human capital theory as an assumption of what education does to students, namely it's a learning process that creates productive skills, might work better in some systems than in other systems actually. Whereas the screening and the sorting and those kinds of explanations related to education might work differently also in different societies, depending on the educational system. So this is the way of reasoning that I'm trying to develop, and today hopefully we'll get some information on that. So as I mentioned, I will present work that comes from two different papers. One is a study that was published in the American Journal of Education recently on reforms in the age of tracking in a number of European societies. And the second study that I'm looking at is to look more specifically at elite schools in the Netherlands. We call them classical gymnasiums, and they're different from the German gymnasiums. They're much smaller in number. They're much more elitist, I would say, because it's part of our higher track. So we have the highest track, and within that highest track, there are two ways of getting to that exam, that final exam, which is a standardized exam in the country. One is the classical gymnasium, and one is some sort of other constellation. And I will look at the classical gymnasium as a place for learning and sorting, as I will explain later. I think the debate about educational systems is also quite lively in Germany. There's a nice example. There are two studies here on Germany. One is by Hartmut Esser and Julian Seuring, and one is by Sönke Matthews. Both are on the German tracking system, having a very different interpretation of the levels of inequality that are emerging in those in a track system. I would say that Hartmut Esser is more in favor of tracking in the sense that it might promote learning, and if we understand inequalities in relation to tracking, it's a hidden kind of inequality that is basically based on test score or ability rather than on anything else. Whereas Sönke Matthews has published a very nice paper that basically is more critical to tracking when it comes to inequality, as tracking doesn't really improve the learning process as much as the proponents of tracking might have hoped for. There's also a nice public debate in England about the grammar schools. I've listed here two people that have let's say public one. Fiona Miller is a publicist, and John Burko we know as the Speaker of the House, right? During the Brexit debates. These two have both different opinions on the grammar school. One says it was a mistake, John Burko, while Fiona Miller keeps defending the grammar school as a very elitist kind of secondary school in England. The grammar school is more similar to the Dutch gymnasium. It's also in terms of numbers and selection processes. So in that sense, it's a bit different from the German one. Also in the Netherlands, at the top left you see, this is the front page of a weekly magazine, the Groene Amsterdammer, the Green Amsterdammer. It's not because it's green in terms of political choice. It used to be a magazine that was printed on green paper 100 years ago, so that's why it's called that way. But it is a bit of a left-wing journal, I would say, magazine. And but it's also a magazine strongly connected to that elitist culture of the gymnasium. So they say, have we now produced the wrong elite in these gymnasiums? So it's a classical debate by now, I think, in many countries. So what I would like to do is to focus on several broader questions that I try to address. First of all, does do reforms to later tracking reduce inequality of opportunity by social background in learning outcomes, educational attainment? Secondly, are these single-track gymnasium schools, these elite gymnasium schools, are they some sort of bastions of inequality where inequality is produced in the school buildings? Or is it more the sorting process that's going on? So I try to disentangle inequalities that might be related to a track system into a sorting process of who goes to which kinds of school, and the learning process, what happens when kids are in a certain kind of school. And I think in the comparative research, including my own, it's very hard to disentangle those different processes of sorting and learning, whereas in this national data that I will show you, where we have registered data on every single kid in the Netherlands of certain cohorts, we can really look more into this learning process as well. So let's think about a bit more in theory about what could sorting and learning be in terms of creating inequalities. First of all, we might think of sorting and learning as a rational process. It's one could say a model of efficiency. It's a model of efficient sorting. Student achievement is the key determinant of where kids end up, and that process creates, let's say, this homogeneous classes that are then producing high learning outcomes, right? That's one rational choice, rational process, let's say, or rational functional, as a sociologist might call it, where everybody ends up at the right place because that creates the most efficient society. So, however, there's another process going on, a more cultural process, thinking of the norms that I just mentioned earlier, a cultural process where categories are created in society actively as part of a power game. So there are inequalities in society, not because they're functional and lead to optimal sorting and learning. No, there are cultural boundary making efforts that create boundaries to maintain social groups closed. A very sociological understanding that is also strongly connected to this whole idea of self-fulfilling prophecies, where once you protect a certain learning environment and you make sure that your own kids do well in those schools, in the classical gymnasiums, for instance, there's some sort of a self-evident proof that these gymnasiums might work, right? So, but that cultural process would also mean that it would then benefit especially those kids that are from advantaged backgrounds, right? Because they have the culture that matches those elite cultures in those schools where they learn Latin and Greek and a strong history component. Whereas if it was a rational process, what happens in those gymnasiums, irrespective of the sorting, who goes there, once kids are in those schools, right, it might be that in fact there's an efficient learning process going on also for disadvantaged students, right? That would be a more rational model of learning rather than this cultural model. So basically we can then, theorize, hypothesize of what we would then find in the data when we separate the sorting and the learning processes, and we look at those from two different theoretical perspectives. We get this optimal sorting, that is, sorting happens on the basis of ability and learning potential. However, in the cultural model, the sorting process is more based on criteria other than school performance or future performance, whereas in the learning process could be rational functional. If once people are sorted, everybody benefits equally from those elite kind of environments, or maybe even the disadvantaged students benefit even more, in the sense that they might get less from the home environment in achieving those skills. And the cultural boundary process, if the learning process is more following this cultural model, then there could be a cultural misfit between, let's say, one's home culture and the school. And then, in fact, it would be very hard for disadvantaged students to do equally well in those elite schools, right? If it was these, if it were these bastions of inequality where, nobody can enter, and once you enter, well, you're a bit unhappy. So that's the basic way of thinking, and basically the reform study that I'm looking at is a bit of both, sorting and learning. I can't really distinguish it because it's a comparative study. However, in the gymnasium study, then I can look more into the learning process. So the first study that I will present briefly is this study that was done on the European social surveys, where, of course, we have adult populations that have reported about their educational attainment. We can assume that they have followed their education in their youth. So we have many cohorts that have educational outcomes, right, over time. In many different countries. So I look at different types of outcomes. I look at the completion of upper secondary education, anything that gives access to higher education later on, which could also be in a vocational training system in the Netherlands, actually. Second, graduation from higher education, so bachelor degree equivalent, today at least. And thirdly, I look at years of schooling. When I look at the second outcome, this graduation from higher education, I follow what we call a MARE model in sociology, a MARE model, transition model of educational attainment, where only the ones that face a particular transition are part of the sample that you then analyze to see if they make that transition. But of course, that creates selection problems, and there's some sort of IV technique that I'm using to address that problem. But the general model for the other variables is basically some sort of a difference in difference model. I don't call it that way. I have to, by the way, I know about the recent debates about difference in difference models. There's a lot going on. I haven't been able to look into this carefully yet. I'm a department chair, and it takes basically all my time. But I will go into this in more detail later. And I'm also happy to say that there are some economists in my university, very well-known ones, who are looking at my data with these new difference in difference debates in mind. So basically what I'm looking at the slope by social background in educational attainment, in these educational outcomes, right? Both by parents' education and by parents' occupation. This is in this study, as well as in another study I did, more on mathematics achievement scores. It's mostly parents' occupation, actually, where we see a change in the effect. Rather than in parents' education. But that's just as a preclude for my results. So it's a model that basically has a tracking age variable, right, at which age kids are tracked in a school system. That varies by cohort and country. And because that's varying by cohort and country, I look at how that interacts with parents' education and parents' occupation as let's say, the interest of this paper, those delta parameters there. And then what's important, so then I have, of course, country-fixed effects, but I also have country-specific inequality slopes. So country-specific trends in inequality. So there's country dummies times parents' occupation. There's also parents' education times birth year, you see? So all those linear terms are there as well. So meaning that there's a linear term of trends in inequality by country. And then, so that's also times country dummies. So by country, I have a trend in the level of inequality by education of the parents and occupation of the parents, and then identify basically these effects of tracking age reforms on top of those baseline trends. So that's the model. These are the tracking age reforms as we've observed them. This is compiled, in fact, by a few economists, Daniele Checchi and Braga and another one. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. They have written a paper about this, and they were in a project with me, the Gini project on income inequality some years ago, and they compiled this data set, so I'm happily using that. So these are, I now added them to the year of birth of the students. So we assume that they go through the educational system in a normal way. We don't know this exactly for the European Social Survey, but that's the assumption we make. And then we see indeed there's quite some reforms happening when it comes to tracking age. Norway, Sweden, Finland, the typical Scandinavian reforms of the 1960s, 70s. France also. We see Germany flat. I know Germany is different than that. It's more varied across Bundesländer, but I looked at it also without Germany, and it's still there. Netherlands is also flat as a pancake, 12 years. We selected age 12. But there's also reforms going to earlier tracking, actually, especially in former Eastern Europe, where after the fall of communism, that had some sort of middle school ideology often, school systems started to select earlier after that period. So this is what we then use as a variation, especially then within countries, of course, because we have these country dummies. The good thing is that we've also compiled in the research groups that I'm part of or leading, other pieces of information that we use as control variables. I've also looked at this as some sort of instruments, but I couldn't really do that, not convincingly, I think. But these are important control variables potentially, namely some form of political ideology at the time of the child's youth. So we have a country cohort database on political ideology, so the equality ideology in government parties, collected in this party manifesto database that is now hosted at the WZB actually, as far as I know. Fantastic database of political pamphlets of all parties that ran for elections over the years in many countries. So, and those are coded, so we know what parties thought about equality as an ideology. And then we look at the government parties, look at the weighted balance of those parties in those governments, and then create what is the government vision, let's say, on equality in this case. We look at the proportion of social democratic seats in government as an indicator of some sort of egalitarian ideology. And we look at income redistribution, a factual measure of how much of the gross income inequality has been reduced to the net income inequality. I also look at compulsory schooling age as another variable that varies across time, and we need to do that because often the tracking reforms came together with later compulsory schooling ages. As I mentioned, I use them as controls, not as an IV model, because of course these could also directly affect educational attainments or inequalities in educational attainments. So in that sense, they don't really qualify as instruments. But I do have an instrumental variable models for this MER model that I just explained. Namely, I use the compulsory schooling age here as a instrument to be able to face the transition to higher education, because that has risen the number of kids that complete secondary education, and they are then the ones in my sample, so to say. These are just statistics, I won't have time for that. But this is perhaps a bit more relevant. So this is a between and within country variance in those indicators. And this is just to illustrate that there's quite some variation, both between and within countries, with regard to all those variables. So this is the ICC, the inter-class correlation, which is the between group variance. So we see the tracking age is 54% is between countries, so the rest is within countries, so to say. So that's quite substantial. So we have variation. That's the message. So the results are like this. We have I've graphed these for different socioeconomic groups. And as I said, by parents' education, we don't find anything. If anything, we might even find larger inequalities with later tracking. But that's controlled for this particular trend that is, I would think, more pronounced. So parents' occupation, the slope, the difference between different socioeconomic groups in how far they children get an education, those slopes differ with later tracking in this model that I'm using. And basically it tells the story that with later tracking, not only the disadvantaged students go up in their likelihood to complete higher upper secondary education or the years of schooling they have attained, but also the children of managers in particular might lose out their advantage. Children of professionals don't see much happening over the age of tracking, but especially children of managers in a sociological understanding, groups that are richer in economic capital and less in cultural capital, they are the ones perhaps losing out more if tracking is postponed. So there's a convergence of those lines, most clearly seen in the left figure here with upper secondary completion. And that's coming from both sides. That's the message here. Also here we find a decline of inequality with later tracking, namely, but again also mostly the managers that are then losing their advantage. And when it comes to graduation from higher education, with this MER model, we have the similar kind of result. There's less inequality, but especially because the children of managers are losing their advantage. Of course, this is on top of a general trend. It's not that they are losing their advantage in absolute terms, but they are losing their advantage in relative terms over the course of expansion that might be there for them too. Some robustness checks. I looked at the models without Scandinavian countries as a typical, region where we might have expected those effects. Still there. I looked only at countries to later tracking, so we're removing the ones that tracked earlier, the Eastern European countries after the fall of communism. And also looked at only reformed countries to later tracking rather than also keeping in the unreformed countries. And I looked at 5-year bands, only 5 years before and after the reform, and also 10-year bands. And I found the same results, which for me is reassuring given the difference in difference debates that we've seen. So now the second paper. I have to check the time, because I don't see any clock in this. Oh yeah, still fine, right? So this is the study, the second study, the Dutch study. Now we have the study of the classical gymnasium, and here I've depicted basically the Dutch system in simple form. Namely, kids go to primary school, starting at age 4, finishing at age 12. Then they enter a tracked system, and then they go to some post-secondary education. That's the standard route. I focus mostly on the secondary system, in the dotted line, and within that system there are 3 basic tracks. There are more, but 3 broad tracks, one could say. Pre-vocational, preparing for some upper secondary vocational school, apprenticeship kind of comparison to the German system. The intermediate general track prepares for what in Germany is known as Fachhochschulen, the second-tier higher education institutions offering bachelor degrees, but mostly in more practical or professionally oriented jobs, so nursing, teachers, IT, and the higher track is the VWO, as we call it, VWO, which is the pre-university exam that prepares for the classical research university, so to say, right? So that's the system, but once you go to that second stage after your primary school, you can go to schools in all kinds of different combinations of those tracks. So we have schools that offer all 3 tracks. We have schools that only offer 1 track, could be any one of those 3. We have schools that offer only sub-tracks within those tracks. So a school can decide what they want in the Dutch system. Schools are very autonomous. They can decide what they want to offer in terms of preparing for a national exam. So if they choose to offer the HAVO program, they can do it. If they want to abolish it, they can do it. It's up to them, right? So schools are very autonomous, but there is a central examination. That's important too. So there's standardization of output, as we call it, and not so much of input. So what schools do, how they do it, it's up to them. But what they do is clear. They should prepare for that national exam, right, at all these levels. So I'm focusing on this VWO exam here. So the children that go to the pre-university program. In proportions, this is much smaller than the German gymnasium. I mean, as a whole, the whole higher track, as we have it, has maybe 20-25% of the students of a cohort. In Germany, it's about half, if I understand well, right? That goes to some form of gymnasium. So with us, it's only 25%, and a sub-fraction of that goes to these classical gymnasiums, right? Because there's many other options to do that VWO exam in schools that are broader, that also offer HAVO exam. By far, most of the schools that offer VWO also offer HAVO. Sometimes even with pre-VMBO, as I said, pre-vocational, that's the dotted line there, it could go in any ways. So basically, if we look at it more simply, if you have a recommendation for the VWO track from your primary school, very important recommendation in the Dutch system, I'll tell more about that. You can choose, will I go to a VWO, or will I, like a classical gymnasium school, a school that only offers the VWO exam, nothing else, no risk of falling down? Huh? Or do I go to a school that is more broad, right? Well, that choice is endogenous, as I don't have to explain to this audience. And so I've found a way to deal with that. So that's the basic idea. And then the question is, do kids that go to that single track VWO school, do they have a higher likelihood to complete the exam in 6 years, which is the nominal time for this program, right? So they go in at 12, do they finish at 18 with that exam, preparing them for entrance into university? So that's the question. And then we have data, which is Dutch register data, which is quite nice now. We have a new system, it's called the National Cohort Study of Education, which are registered data prepared for researchers. So you log in at the Central Statistical Office, you click on the variables you want, and it retrieves those variables from various sources into one longitudinal database, just as you please. And including information about parents' income, which are taken from the tax records, information about the schools, to the extent that that's available, all kinds of things are available, and of course student achievement and the whole school career of the students you can follow also. It's fantastic actually, and it's only been used recently. You might have seen a paper, quite a famous paper already, on the COVID effects on learning on the Dutch schooling system. They used something similar by Per Engel. A few people from Oxford have done that. And now it's done, so their data was based on a commercial connection they had with some offers of help for schools. But now it's done on these registered data as well, and pretty much the same results, namely big loss of, or delay of learning, I would say, in COVID times. So what we have is the following. From the first wave, when the kids are in the last year of primary school, around the age of 11, 12, we have their standardized school test, national school test, that is standardized across the country. Not quite, but I don't have time for that. It's a standardized school test that is known as the CITO test by most Dutch people. And there's teacher recommendation, and it's extremely important what the recommendation of the teacher is for your school. It basically gives the options. If your teacher says you get a HAVO recommendation, there's no VWO school, academic school, that will take you. Even if the school decides, the receiving school, they decide, but they rely pretty much on the recommendation. Recommendation is strongly influenced by the school test, of course, and also by all kinds of tests that the kids do for years in the primary school system. So we have standardized tests every year, and that's why we know for the COVID effects that even in grade 4 and lower grades, we see what the loss is in learning. So there's a lot of information available. I'm using the final test only here. And then, of course, we also have these origin variables of the students. So we know the parents' education, their occupation, and their migration background. So when students are then in the next year, we know to which school they went to, right? What are the offerings of that school? Is it a school that only offered the VWO exam, or was it a school that offered broader exams? My sample is only reduced to ones that have the pre-university track exam recommendation. So only that small fraction that gets only that recommendation. No mixed recommendation, which is also common in the Netherlands, HAVO, VWO, or no, only the ones that are the highest achievers as my sample, so to say, right? And then I know to which school they went to, and I know what is their exam level after 6 years. So did they finish that exam at that level? By the way, we also have subjects. I didn't do anything with it, but we also know which subjects they chose, what were the grades for their exams, everything we know. So it's fantastic data. As I mentioned, the choice of school, whether you go to a broad school or a small school, is of course endogenous. And in fact, the whole sorting idea of my theory is that it is endogenous, right? There might be cultural boundaries in the sorting process, making some families more likely to go to those schools than other families. So I was trying to find an instrument that might explain the likelihood to go into one school rather than the other. That is hopefully somewhat random, and that's the distance that I'm using towards those schools. So what I'm using is as an instrument is a difference in the distance between the two options you have. Do I go to the classical gymnasium or VWO plus, a school that offers that but also something else. And the relative distance or the difference in the distance is basically my instrument. So if it is positive, it means that, well, I'll get to that later. I'm using these differences in the distances because from medical studies, it's known that also distance to hospitals is sometimes used as an instrument. You should use the distance to different types of providers as a better instrument. And of course, these are definitely not totally random, even with this distance, but that's, I think, part of my story. And in fact, it makes that we look at these local average treatment effects, as far as I understand. So what we have are single versus multi-track pre-university schools, and again, we look at the diploma within 6 years. And I can do it by subgroups, by household income, by parents' degree, and migration background. So that's basically what we look at. So now, first look at the sorting process. Who goes to those classical gymnasiums, right? So these are students all with a university preparation recommendation. So the teachers thinks of them, this is the top group of of the distribution. And we see that there are quite some gaps by parents' income, especially the highest income group, the highest quintile here, has a much higher likelihood to go to those classical gymnasiums, even among those with the same kind of teacher recommendation, and even in that red bar, controlled for the variation within that group in their student test scores, right? So controlled for that. So we see these are logit coefficients, or log odds. We could exponentiate them. These are, odds ratios of 1.3 or 1.4 times higher likelihood to go to those schools. We see the same for parents with at least one university degree among them. And we see actually, with migration background, positive slopes relative to the Dutch majority population, meaning that they given the situation, given their recommendation, their social class, they have a higher likelihood to go to those classical gymnasiums. So that's the sorting process, and we can't explain this with performance, right? Because that's totally controlled here. So this, in my interpretation, is the cultural boundary process. Who goes to those schools? This is the relative distance. So for most kids, the distance to those broader schools is smaller. The distance to the gymnasiums is larger than the ones for the broader schools. And you can, I model this also in the sense that there are some, inequalities in the distance to those schools. And urbanity, being in a large city, is of course quite a big predictor. So I control for that in my models. So now we focus on the learning process. So the effects, once kids are in the schools, what happens in the likelihood to go to that exam after 6 years. And you see that basically the effects are positive. So once you go to the classical gymnasiums, you have a positive effect of the likelihood is 0.10, something like that, higher to reach that diploma in 6 years, right? We also see that the effect is different across subgroups, but more in line with this efficient model of sorting and learning, more efficient model of learning than in line with this cultural model. Because we see that especially children of disadvantaged backgrounds have more benefit from these classical gymnasiums. They're not culturally mismatched in such a way that they are harmed by this process, right? So for them, the effects are steeper, and for the ones of parents with a degree, the square box, the third estimate there, parents with a degree, the effect is not even different from 0. You might say, but these are register data, population data, why do we have significance tests? Well, we have only one test that is available in the system, so I think it's still useful to look at the significance test here. So in any case, if anything, the effects are positive for everybody, or at least more even for the ones of disadvantaged backgrounds. So that gives hope for those schools, right? It's mostly the sorting process that creates inequality, in the way I understand it, more than the learning process in those schools. But the sorting process is hard to tackle, also from a policy perspective, right? If you think of it, it's very hard because those schools are really trying to protect their situation. There was a recommendation by the Education Council, which is some sort of advisory body of the government that I'm part of, and we recommended that every kid in the Netherlands should go to a 3-year bridge period. So we postponed the moment of selection for 3 years. They're in the same school building. They could have different tracks within those schools, but not across schools. And everybody has still the option to reach anything they want after the age of 12, because it's too young to determine kids' careers so early. Those schools are, of course, very much protesting against this, right? Because they say, okay, but we have these classical gymnasium schools, these standalone schools that are doing so well, and this evidence does make the discussion not much easier, because it's the sorting process, I would say, the cultural sorting process more than the efficient sorting process that creates these inequalities, and not so much the learning process. So to sum up, I think later tracking has reduced inequalities by SES. There are classical gymnasiums in the Netherlands that, they might create inequalities, but mostly by sorting and not so much by learning, as far as I understand it. And so maybe the sorting into schools can be seen as both a rational functional process, meritocratic process, and the cultural process, right? I'm not denying that there's meritocratic sorting going on in those schools, but there's also a cultural process on top of that is, I think, quite important. But learning inside schools seems to be more following this rational functional model, and not so much the cultural model. And that is hopeful, I would say. It's hopeful in the sense that education really helps people that are needing education most. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you a lot for your presentation. Now we have 10 minutes left for comments or questions, and I hope there are some. Okay, then I would not think about it. I have a question, a general question. How did you handle, you show in the first part of your presentation, you show the difference between the states in tracking and in the age of tracking. How did you handle the differences within the states? You said, okay, in Germany it's a little bit hard to generalize this, but how did you tackle this challenge?
So I think in Germany it's true that this is, but I think it's the only case where this is so clearly different between Bundesländer, right? Because Bundesländer are the units where policy is made, is determined. In the other countries, reforms have been made across the country, but sometimes in different time phases. So that is true. So for instance, in Sweden, I think the reform has lasted maybe over 5 or 6 years. So they didn't do it at once, but they went in a process. That variation has in fact been exploited by scholars in economics. I forgot the name of the authors, but a very nice paper looking at this regional variation in the timing to see how later tracking reduces inequalities. In Finland, I think also they had some sort of a process going on, and that process I haven't captured. So I looked at the official timing when this has changed, but it might have been the first of the cohorts that have changed in fact that way. I don't think there are other countries where the variation has been as regional as it is in Germany. It is true that even if age of selection is determined at a certain age, there could still be different constellations of how this is happening, right? I told you about the Dutch flat as a pancake rule of 12, but a lot has happened since the 1960s. So in the 1960s there was a big reform, not to affect the tracking age, but to make schools broader and to make movements across the tracks more likely. And in fact, we still have those rules, but the schools have become smaller in the past 15 years or so, maybe 10 years. So schools have become smaller because they're free to do what they want, as I said. And so in a way, we're back before to the time before the reform of the 1960s, where schools became smaller and only catering their own group, so to say. And that that's not in my models, right? In that sense, it's a simplification. And my feeling is that with comparative data, it's interesting to study these things, but we need different types of models different types of data to look at these questions from the same kind of angle. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. And I didn't know before. I think it's very interesting. That there are also some similarities between the Netherlands and Germany as regards tracking. And I was just wondering, when it comes to solving the sorting problem, is there any evidence on how teachers do their recommendations? So we have some research on that here in Germany now, and it's somehow the question whether this could be solved by just relying on test scores. Or what do you think?
So it's an interesting question in the sense that, so if you look at, let's say, if there was some sort of a dimension of standardization, right, where on the least standardized would be the traditional German model, I would say, where parents decide where the kids go to, right, parents' preference. Second step is binding recommendations as we see it in Germany in some states, right? I know studies that have exploited these differences. And then a step beyond that is perhaps the Dutch system, where there's a recommendation plus a standardized test, right? So now we have debates in the Netherlands whether we should go back to the teacher recommendation more. And in fact, that has happened. So in 2015 or 16, after my cohort, so the arrow went the other way around. So it's not the school test that determines the recommendation, but the recommendation is given first, interestingly enough. So they give the recommendation in March, and the kids do the end of school test in April, which I think is crazy, honestly, but that's what they did. And the idea was that this test became so important to families that they, bought shadow education and all kinds of pressures on the kids that would then be alleviated if the test was done later. But I think it's a wrong counterfactor. The counterfactor is not that parents don't care, right? The counterfactor is that parents do care and still do their buying in the shadow education. And certainly if there's more uncertainty rather than more certainty, this happens. So in fact, it has not worked. And it has increased inequality, actually. So the Inspectorate of Education was a fantastic research department in the Netherlands. They've done a nice study where they saw indeed the gaps in the track that students went into increased when this reform was taking place, when the test result was done, became less important, so to say, and the teacher became more important. And here the debate is very much, of course, between the field, who thinks that they can recommend neutrally, and science, who say that the tests are so important, right? So we're also doing now experiments in Amsterdam with Sarah Geven, who is working on this in a project of hers, where we look at teacher recommendations. We basically do some sort of a vignette study, a factorial survey design, where we present hypothetical students to teachers in different countries also, and ask them what is the likelihood that this student will do well in school later or something. And we see that there are biases among teachers in how they recommend what they expect from students, whether those biases are realistic or a true bias in the sense that this creates, it discriminates on some sort of a taste-based discrimination. We don't really know because, teachers might weigh in all kinds of important features of families, namely, does the family help with homework? That might be realistic but not fair. There's a difference between realism and fairness here, I would think. What's interesting in our results is that we looked at teachers in Amsterdam and New York and Oslo to catch different educational systems, basically. And it was very clear that school performance of the kid was way more important in the expectations that teachers have in the Netherlands than in the other countries. And these are teachers that teach 11-year-olds, right? So we hope them to be a bit naive, in a good sense of the word, right? But they're not in the Netherlands. They're just very strongly geared on that meritocratic track already.
Regarding the time, I suggest that we have 2 questions. First from Simon Gren, and then Ludger Wörsmann, please. And then we go to the break after.
I will be quick. Thanks a lot for this presentation. It was very interesting. I was wondering about your first point here, and if you have an idea why it's only when you look on parents' occupation that this seems to be a good, or when you find your relationship, is it that the education is just a too crude measure, or does the occupation capture something else?
Very good question. I didn't talk about that much, but I think there's it's a bit of a sociological theory, one could say. We haven't tested it that well. But my feeling is, the explanation could be that when parents are strongly connected to education themselves, they make it work, whatever the system is. They make it work that their children do well in school. So you can select later, they will find a way to make it work. If there's standardized tests, they will make it work. In sociology, sometimes this is called compensatory advantage. So, it's to deal with, parents of more advantaged families are able to deal with, let's say, difficult situations better. They just make it work. And so that applies to education when parents are strongly concerned with education themselves. That's why we don't see it much for professionals and for parents' education. And again, in a different study where I used these earlier school tests, comparative school tests on mathematics achievement, same finding. Also there, not for education, but only for the parents' occupation. And there's another theory that I thought about, another explanation, which it has to do with the teachers. If teachers are biased about families, they might be more biased about contemporary characteristics of parents than they are about parents' education, right? Because they don't know that, perhaps. So that could be another explanation that I thought about, but these are all speculative. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Super interesting. I find it hard to be brief, so I just pick one little thing off of the different things I have in mind. I mean, first, I do think it's a different questions about whether you have like a whole comprehensive system or whether in a system you have both then a single high track and a comprehensive high track thing. I mean, the processes that happen in the general equilibrium there will be very different. And I mean, this really translates into the public debate. In Germany, the Gesamtschulen are just not the same as having a non-tracked system. Because it's very specific people choosing to go into Gesamtschulen, which is like this multi-track, higher track system, apparently, as opposed to the Gymnasium. I mean, and this sorting is like immense and probably very negative for Gesamtschulen, and you can easily show that. And I'm not quite sure to what extent this may be the same going on here. I don't know your country. Of course, you have this idea about the relative distance to get exactly at that, to get some random thing there. It's just that I can see how that helps a lot. So I find that really interesting. On the other hand, thinking it through, I mean, you told us schools can choose whatever they offer and so on. And so it's just not random where the traditional gymnasiums are placed. And just because of that, the distance won't give you like random variation because it's just like you're there. And so I can easily see how a kid from a low educated background that happens to live in an area where all the people are that favor this traditional gymnasium, once he actually made the cut to go to this and go there, probably learns much more there than in the multi-track ones. It answers a very different question to me, and it's probably not random like where they go. Bottom line is then, I'm not quite sure I do buy your conclusion that these classical gymnasiums do not magnify inequality in learning. I don't think that's what you've shown. I think you show that they are important and they help disadvantaged kids who happen to go there, but at the end of the day, probably so few of the disadvantaged kids go there that at the end of the day, probably they magnify inequality a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, to be clear, I don't deny that at all. That's my story. So it's a sorting process who goes to those schools more than anything else. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. So I think we agree there. So, and you know, to give a bit of illustration, the situation is very different from Germany. If you compare, let's say, my broader schools and the Gesamtschule in Germany. So the Gesamtschule, as far as I understand, is something that came later to equalize opportunities, right? It was an active model to improve the possibilities for kids to go to the gymnasiums within those Gesamtschule. So the total of 50% going into the gymnasiums is including those Gesamtschule, as far as I understand, right? Or is it? Oh, okay. Anyway, so, but it's totally different in the sense that the classical gymnasiums that I'm talking about, there are 41 of them in the country. I've got 47 in my data, meaning that there are 6 schools outside those classical gymnasiums that are also standalone schools that offer the VWO exam, but maybe not with Latin and Greek. So so it's pretty much the same. I've captured basically those 41 schools. Those 41 schools have existed forever, right? It's not that they are now placed in certain areas to cater a certain population, but it's true that they're in the big cities, right? All the gymnasia are in cities that are larger than 100,000 inhabitants. Or not all of them, but I think 90% of them. So this means that, and you know, then there's what are the broader schools in the Dutch system are way more common as a standard model to go to the VWO exam. It's been there forever. It's not a new effort to improve opportunities. It was just the most standard way to go to school, is to go to a school that is broader, especially since the 1960s. But there are some traces of historical traces of differences that might in fact speak more to what you're saying. So the gymnasiums, they've existed since the 19th century, or even before. But in the 19th century, they were really called gymnasiums, but they were kept in the higher education system by law. So funny enough, at age 12, kids that go to gymnasiums, they went into the educational system that was covered by the higher education law. Now no longer anymore, but that was in the late 1800s. And the VWO, the other type of program that leads to exactly the same exam, right? We're talking about the national exam here. So you get the same exam for mathematics, all those basic subjects. It's exactly the same exam you go to. In the broader schools, they might be more what is used to be called some sort of citizen school or something, to get more professional training for the higher professions in the late 19th century. So that might be still there. In that sense, now everything is under the same law, already a long time. since the 1940s, no, the 30s, I think even. So it's been in the same law, maybe the 1960s actually, for a long time. But there are still these traces of that gymnasium as being something that is different from the HBS, the citizens school, in the sense that, you know, citizen school was meant to prepare for the workforce, and the classical gymnasium was prepared to go to university, and, you know, with a strong cultural component. So there are differences, and you know, the whole idea that my sorting hypothesis means that there are social differences in those likelihoods to go to those schools implies that they're not randomly distributed across the population, right? In that sense, it is less clearly a purely causal analysis that you might find, but I think at least what my results show is that there's no harm for culturally mismatched students in those gymnasiums, which could be one reason to be against them, one could say, from a policy perspective. And again, I'm not trying to defend the gymnasiums here, because I think the sorting process is really what creates inequality, and that is hard to tackle with policy, especially in this autonomous system as we have it.
Thank you. With regard to the time, I would suggest that we continue the discussions in the short break, and after that we continue with the first panel.
Okay.
Thank you a lot.